And thank you everybody for coping with our technical glitches, but it's pretty impressive. We're all women, younger, multi-generation, and here we are spanning 4 different time zones. My name is Chris. Movement of women mobilizing for peace on the Korean Peninsula. Joining me are some amazing longtime activists, as well as Jacqueline Wells, who's our communications coordinator, who is working the back end. So thank you so much, Jacqueline. And a quick shout out to Jacqueline's mother, Gail, who's one of our members. Happy birthday. So thank you for joining us on such short notice, but several US peace organizations decided that in this heightened moment of tensions on the Korean Peninsula, especially with 10 days of war drills conducted by the US and South Korea, that we should launch national actions that call for peace and diplomacy. We thought this would be an important opportunity to educate our community on these war drills, and especially how they impact neighboring US allies in the region, territories, and states, including Hawaii. So with the International Women's Network Against Militarism, we're pleased to bring you this webinar, which we hope to do in 1 hour. So I'll start with a quick overview of these war games. Then Gwen Kirk will provide a regional analysis, and Hyun Lee will then speak to Trump's preventive war. Lisa Natividad will give perspective from Guam on how their island is caught in the crossfire. And then we'll bring it back to Terry Kukulani, who will bring it the perspective from Hawaii and how Hawaii has become an unwilling accomplice and target for more military destruction and violence. Every speaker will have 8 minutes, so we hope to have at least 15 minutes in the end to field Q&As. It's a lot of ground to cover, literally, so let me get started right away. After 3 years of fighting and 4 million people were killed, the Korean War ended in a stalemate with a ceasefire, the Armistice Agreement. It was signed by the military commanders of the United States, representing the UN command that included South Korea, China, and North Korea. As the war ended with just a ceasefire and not a peace treaty, that the Korean Peninsula has been in a state of war, with both sides preparing for military conflict. The US and South Korea, thus, has been conducting joint military exercises involving hundreds of thousands of troops since the end of the Korean War. Twice a year, the US and South Korea conduct large-scale war drills in preparation for an attack from North Korea. In the spring, they conduct for weeks the Key Resolve Full Eagle. It's the world's largest drills involving 300,000 South Korean and several thousands, tens of thousands of US troops. In August, now, in the late summer, they conduct the Ulchi Freedom Guardian military exercises. This is the world's largest simulated computer war drills, involves tens of thousands of troops, and it can grow up to 530,000 individuals, including government officials and civilians. These war drills were started in response to a 1968 North Korean raid on the South Korean while these war drills occur regularly, this time they fall on the heels of 2 intercontinental ballistic missiles tested by North Korea in July, and threats from Donald Trump that the US would unleash, quote, fire and fury like the world has never seen on North Korea, followed by statements that the US was locked and loaded. Pyongyang responded by threatening to fire missiles into waters surrounding Guam. H.R. McMaster, Trump's top national security advisor, said the US was fully prepared for a, quote, preventive war to stop North Korea, quote, from threatening the US with a nuclear weapon, end quote. The Trump administration also announced US travel ban to North Korea following the death of Otto Warmbier, and now forcing over 200 Americans to abandon critical humanitarian aid operations. This all signals that tensions are about to get worse. Pyongyang, however, views these war drills as a rehearsal for an invasion, especially since they include simulations of surgical strikes on North Korean targets and decapitation of its leadership. On the eve of the war drills, North Korea's Rodong Shinmun wrote that they are, quote, the most explicit expression of hostility and would be, quote, pouring gasoline on fire in an already heightened tensions between US and North Korea. And there's a quote about the Korean People's Army is keeping high alert, fully ready to contain the enemies. It will take resolute steps the moment even a slight sign of the preventive war is spotted. So now we're at this situation where if North Korea is advancing for each test that they conduct, missile test, it's improving its capability to strike the US mainland, then one would think that the Trump administration would seriously think about what are off-ramps towards negotiations. Well, one such potential proposal is known as the freeze for freeze. This was first proposed by North Korea, said that it would halt its nuclear and missile tests in exchange for halting US and South Korean war drills. And this is a quote from the North Korean ambassador to India. We are willing to talk in terms of freezing nuclear tests or missile testing if the American side completely stops big, large-scale military exercises. It has also been backed by China and Russia. North Korea, this is from Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, who said that also that the suspension should happen for suspension. And even former US government officials say that the dual freeze could lead to a breakthrough in the impasse. This is John Merrill, the former head of research and intelligence for the State Department for East Asia. And he says, a freeze for freeze option is the only remaining viable option to diffuse the current crisis. It is actionable and carries relatively little risk. If successful, the payoff could be peace. So I think it's important to note that these exercises have been canceled in the past. In the lead up to the agreed framework, which was the deal that froze North Korea's nuclear weapons program by the Clinton administration in the early 1990s, the US and South Korea actually halted team spirit exercises. So it has been done, there has precedence, and this seems to be the time when peace movements around the world, but especially here in the US, and joining with the peace movement in South Korea, should be calling for this proposal. So during these 10-day war games, there have been protests daily outside the US Embassy in Seoul. The picture on the bottom right is from that. And in the past several weeks, protests have been held in Washington, DC, that's in the bottom left, in Los Angeles, that's in the upper left, and in Boston, calling on the Trump administration to ratchet down its dangerous rhetoric and engage in diplomacy, not more brinkmanship. So thank you. Now I'm going to turn it over to Gwen Kirk, who is, let me grab my little bio sheet. She's a writer, teacher, and organizer and founding member of Women for Genuine Security and the International Women's Network Against Militarism. Gwen is also a steering committee member of Women Across DMZ and a teacher to so many peace activists and feminists around the world. Thank you, Gwen.
Thanks. Well, it's so encouraging to see those screens, photos of activists protesting this. I want to go back a little bit and talk a bit more about the context. What we're reading in the mainstream US media, suggests a crazy person and a rational person who are in some way equal or with parity. So it's as well to remember, and probably people listening will know this, but I think it's useful to just rehearse it because we're not seeing this in the media's reports. The US approach to militarism around the world, it divides the world into 6 commands. The Pacific Command really covers virtually half the world's surface, headquarters in Hawaii, and stretches all the way to, I can't quite see it, but on the left-hand side of the screen includes India, and so many other countries. This one just focuses on bases, allies, and forces. So the Pacific Command has 375,000 personnel, most of them in uniform. The 7th Fleet can, sail across these waters pretty much at will. Its 200 ships include 5 aircraft carrier groups and over 1,000 aircraft. Also Air Force bases, Marine Corps bases, and Army bases in South Korea, in Japan, and of course in Guam. Philippines has no official bases, although there are US troops rotating in and out of there, and plans for United States troops to use Philippine bases. Australia, new bases going in there, and also new access agreements to the left of the screen around Singapore, the Malacca Straits, and so on. So a huge military presence that is shifting as states decides that new needs come up. Now looking at military spending, just a reminder, United States top of the list, $611 billion in 2016. Trump administration wants to increase that. With the exception of China and Russia, all the other countries in the top 10 are US allies. So all that money for troops and weaponry and so on kind of is on the same side. Here we go. So since this is a lot of argument here about nuclear weapons, I thought it was useful to look at what is estimated. And you can see Russia on the left, United States very close, retired ones in black, stockpiled ones in that yellowy color, and then deployed ones at the bottom, followed by France, China, UK, Pakistan, India. Okay. So one of the things that we're seeing in the news really is kind of like a crazy person, and a lot of language about unhinged, crazy. This is the way in which I think Trump is playing into this kind of posturing that we're seeing from North Korea. Here's the two tough guys duking it out. Both of them involved in the media suggests that it's all very unpredictable, whereas in fact I think there's quite a lot of rationality behind both sides' posture. We'll hear a lot more from Hyun about the North Korean situation, but also I think Donald Trump has done a really good job of taking a lot of bad news off the front pages of the news reporting by these threats. And because the United States overall is so wedded to war in terms of economic investments, political assumptions, and popular culture, we get media people now saying in all seriousness, he looks so presidential when he's threatening to go to war. So bluster, bravado, denials, and insults, lies, being traded back and forth. We're only seeing one of these characters in this way, whereas really we should be seeing Trump like that too. I don't want to suggest that those few nuclear warheads are in any way something to be, sanguine about. Here's a harrowing painting by Irin Toshimaruki from the Hiroshima panels, a really graphic, depiction of the results of one relatively small nuclear warhead. But keeping everything in perspective here, I guess the main point I want to make is that this, seeing this polarized situation as if there are two equal protagonists really flies in the face of this whole picture that I'm wanting to, show here. And just to end with a view of some of the women who Christine and Lisa and I and others heard talk when we were in Pyongyang 2 years ago. The older women on the front row were people who had been young during the Korean War. They talked a lot about their experiences of the war, how terrifying it was, and how complete the devastation. The younger women behind them are scholars who talked a lot about the impacts on ordinary people of the long-standing sanctions that have been imposed on North Korea. So it was very moving to hear them talking directly about these issues And their conclusion, which perhaps many of us would share, was that, in the event of war, women and children particularly, and of course the environment also, suffer tremendously. So something to be avoided at all costs. I'm about to pass over now. That's my kind of little overview. Stopping sharing.
Thank you so much, Gwen. Now I'm going to move over to Hyun Lee, who is in the midst of moving, and so she's going to grace us with. Is there a way to brighten the video at all?
I'm so sorry. I'm in a room with a very ugly fluorescent light, and I'm sorry. My face looks like it's completely. You can't even make out my eyes, right?
Yeah.
to sit like this.
Well,
Anyway.
I'm sure we'll compensate with brilliance. So let me just quickly introduce Hyun. She's a New York City-based writer. She's one of the co-founders of Zoom in Korea, which is bringing really cutting-edge progressive analysis from the Korean Peninsula and across the U.S. She's a member of the Solidarity Committee for Democracy and Peace in Korea and a Korea Policy Institute fellow. So Hyun will give us some perspective about U.S. preventive war.
Thank you, Christine, and thanks for Women Cross DMZ for organizing this. I unfortunately do not have brilliant visual aids. I feel like I'm a delinquent panelist, but hopefully I'll have something useful to contribute. I'm going to start by talking about what the two sides of the conflict, namely the US and the DPRK, what do they want? To understand the nature of the current conflict, and then just talk about the recent developments that we've seen that have escalated tensions and have created a very dangerous situation in the Korean Peninsula. So, what do the two sides want? It's very basic, I'm sure you all know already, but just to review, the United States, what it wants is complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. They call it CVID. And North Korea has categorically rejected this. They presumably noted what happened to Iraq and Libya after they laid down their arms, and North Korea has declared that as long as the United States maintains what it calls its hostile policy and its nuclear threats against it, North Korea's nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles will never be on the table for negotiation. So that's North Korea's position. What does North Korea want? What they want is an end to the very provocative U.S. military exercises that Christine mentioned earlier, also replacing the armistice, which is a temporary ceasefire, with a permanent peace agreement, and then the final withdrawal of U.S. troops from the Korean Peninsula in accordance with the original armistice. These obviously are out of the question for the United States, which considers South Korea a very strategic foothold for its presence in Asia. So the two parties' interests are very much directly opposed, and that's why they are locked in this seemingly perpetual standoff, with North Korea continuously firing off, more and more advanced missiles, and then the United States piling on more and more sanctions. And by doing so, what both sides are trying to do is force the other side to capitulate before they eventually come to the negotiating table. North Korea has offered a solution to ease the current tensions. It has offered the freeze for freeze option that Christine mentioned earlier. It said we will stop testing nuclear weapons and missiles if the United States stops military exercises. Which obviously relies on perpetual war, and it needs North Korea as a boogeyman so that it can continue to sell weapons of mass destruction in the region. Particularly to South Korea and also to Japan. As we know, in July, North Korea carried out 2 missile tests, Hwasong-14 and Hwasong-12. Many experts have said now they have an ICBM capable of reaching the continental United States. This is a game changer, not because what the corporate media says, that Washington actually thinks that that North Korea will fire off its missile to attack the United States. That will not happen, and Washington knows that. Why it's a game changer is because it is an effective deterrent, which means that changes the strategic balance in the region and U.S. Strategy in the region. Just to mention a little bit about the sanctions, The U.S. says North are in violation of UN resolutions, and that's the basis of its sanctions. But we should be clear that there is no international law that prohibits countries from testing nuclear and ballistic missile tests. As peace activists, as nuclear disarmament activists, we wish there were international laws that prohibit countries from doing so, but currently there isn't. So there is no legal basis for the UN resolutions that condemn North Korea's nuclear and missile tests. And, we should also note that the UN Security Council, particularly the permanent 5 members of it, they all have nuclear weapons. They have no legal or moral authority to dictate who should have and who shouldn't have nuclear weapons. Now, to talk about more recent developments, from March to August of this year, the U.S. increased the number of B-1B flights over the Korean Peninsula. What is B-1B? It is a strategic bomber with laser-guided, long-range precision strike munitions, bombs, that can strike moving targets. One B-1B bomber can launch 48 of these bombs, and the flights that the U.S. has been conducting are precision strike exercises, and they simulate a real war scenario. These exercises took place multiple times in March, in April, in May, at least 10 times within the last 6 months. On July 28th, the 38th Expeditionary Bomb Squadron, which is normally based in South Dakota, deployed to Andersen Air Force Base in Guam. One of these bomb squadrons is composed of 6 B-1B bombers and 350 airmen. So what that means is now there is a preemptive strike force offensively deployed in Guam that would become the front line in a war with North Korea. At the end of June, we all know that a range of options on how to deal with North Korea was prepared and presented to Trump, and this included a military option. H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, he said publicly that the military option was prepared and was part of this range of options. And then on July 4th, when North Korea launched its first ICBM, the White House convened an emergency meeting. Trump was out golfing. It's safe to assume that the military option was discussed at this meeting. In early August, the Washington Post publicized a DIA assessment that North Korea has now successfully produced a miniaturized nuclear warhead that can fit inside these missiles. This is significant because once the United States officially recognizes that North Korea has an effective deterrent, then what that means is that there are only 2 options. So denuclearization is now off the table, and there are only 2 choices. Either withdraw U.S. troops and find a way to coexist with a nuclear North Korea, or eliminate North Korea's nuclear weapons, which means using force. Trump seems to be basically stuck between 2 very terrible options from a U.S. strategic point of view. But this is, right after we saw that DIA assessment is when we heard Lindsey Graham. He did an interview on NBC. He said, oh, well, I had a conversation with Trump where he told me, if there's going to be a war, it's going to be over there. If thousands of people die, it's going to be over there, not here. So that was the conversation that Trump had. And then McMaster was on MSNBC a few days later, and he was actually asked point blank, is your administration trying to prepare the U.S. public for a first strike at North Korea? And he basically, answered in the affirmative. He didn't say we are trying to prepare the U.S. public, but he said we are considering all options, and a military option is definitely one of those options. And obviously, and he said preventive war is one of those options. So preventive war obviously means preemptive strike. And the key to U.S. preemptive strike against North Korea is the B-1B strategic bomber that is based in Andersen Air Force Base in Guam. So if we put those two things together, the increased B-1B flights over Korea in the past 6 months, and then McMaster's comments about a preventive war, this is the backdrop for North Korea's that it has plans to launch a medium long-range ballistic missile toward the waters near Guam. As Christine mentioned, and as I said earlier, North Korea did offer to freeze these tests in exchange for the U.S. stopping its military exercises. As we all know, the U.S. Went ahead with the Ulchi Freedom Guardian exercises that are taking place right now. It seems to be at a reduced scale. So they reduced the troops by about 7,500, which is pretty significant. But they're going ahead with these exercises, which means that North Korea at any point may follow through on the warning that it issued about launching a Hwasong-12 towards the waters off of Guam. What might happen when North Korea, if and North Korea does that, the U.S. has said in the past, oh, we're going to use our missile defense system to shoot it down. Can it actually do that? A RAND Corporation analyst, his name is Bruce Bennett. He was recently interviewed on CNN, and he said, well, we're not sure if we can actually do that. This is an experimental system, he said, even though we spend so much billions of dollars on these systems. And then he said, even people who make cell phones test their product more than people who test, make the THAAD missile defense system. And, you know, even so, sometimes cell phones burn up. So who knows what will happen to the THAAD missile defense system? These were his comments on CNN. We know that there is a THAAD system now that is newly deployed in Seongju, South Korea. The people there have been fighting it since last year. It is not going to be effective against the Hwasong-12 because experts have pointed out that Hwasong-12, when it's launched from North Korea to Guam, it flies at an altitude of 850 kilometers. The THAAD missile defense system only reaches 150 kilometers, so there's no way that it can shoot it down. So what North Korea seems to be doing is by threatening to shoot 4 missiles simultaneously towards Guam, is calling U.S. bluff on its missile defense system. Basically, that the U.S. does not have the ability to shoot down these missiles. In conclusion, all of these developments are basically producing, obviously, a very dangerous situation. And unfortunately, I believe that this will go on for some time, and there is a real threat of war. And the only sensible path, as Christine mentioned, is a freeze, a nuclear freeze in North Korea in exchange for ending the provocative war games, ending the U.S. nuclear first strike prerogative, and ending the Korean War by signing a peace treaty, and ending the U.S. troop presence on the Korean Peninsula. So, you know, we need to continue to be vigilant as peace activists to oppose war. You know, we have to demand that the U.S. stop these dangerous war games to move towards dialogue, and obviously build solidarity among people resisting U.S. bases in the region. You know, the U.S. bases have been an occupying force in Guam, Hawaii, the Philippines, Okinawa. You know, we need to demand, you know, the entire thing out of the entire region. And, you know, and lastly, we need to continue to educate the U.S. public, particularly progressive allies, about the root of this crisis. You know, this false equivalence that, you know, Kim Jong-un and Trump are the same. We need to, you know, inform people that North Korea is not crazy, and it is not a threat to the world. It has a no first strike policy. It declared it during its 7th Party Congress last year. The U.S. does not have a no first strike policy. And lastly, I know I keep saying lastly, this is really the lastly, we need to start posing the question, you know, if we want North Korea to stop these missile tests, then what would it take to create the conditions so that North Korea does not have to resort to these missile tests and nuclear weapons to defend its sovereignty. And I think that's the conversation that progressive people in the U.S. need to start having.
Great. Thank you so much, Hyun. Okay, that was heavy, and now we're moving on to even more difficult information and analysis. And thank you. We're joined by Lisa Linda Natividad. She's the president of the Guahan Coalition for Peace and Justice, and she's an associate professor of social work at the University of Guam. She's also a member of the International Network of Women Against Militarism and Women Cross TMC. She participated in the 2015 crossing. Thank you, Lisa, for joining us.
Half a day. Thank you, Christine. I start my presentation off with this slide that demonstrates very graphically Guahan, as we call our native land, often referred to Guam's very important strategic geographical location. In some way, the Pacific isolated, as this slide indicates, it's our greatest joy, but in other times it also is our greatest curse. And as you can see with this slide actually was a slide that was developed by the Department of Defense themselves around 2009. And so you can see that with multiple triangles of red arrows, Guam is very strategic in terms of these different military exercises, proximity, and especially to the east, with their proximity and close to China as well as DPKR. So if you look on the right side of the slide, it has Guam's population that was projected at the time, although the more truer number is about 160,000 people. The present DoD population that was indicated by the Department of Defense in 2009 was a little over 14,000. This number, though, is not just active duty troops. It also includes their dependents and family members. In addition, the slide contains the future DoD population projection, which at the time was 40,000. This number has dwindled a little bit down after its announcement of transferring Marines, U.S. Marines from Okinawa to the island. So currently, the Department of Defense's foothold on our island as occupied territory is roughly 1/3 of the island, about 29%, depending on which installations you count. Some more generous figures say that that number is closer to 33% of the island. So politically, Guam is an unincorporated territory of the United States, which being a U.S. territory. Next slide. In 2006, the governments of the United States and Japan entered into an accord. People on Guam were made aware of this by media in Japan, and part of this huge accord, or this accord, indicated a huge, massive military buildup on the island. And so part of what this entailed was the relocation of these troops, the development of a base and training grounds area, as well as expansion of the U.S.'s current military footprint, particularly in the southern base of the naval base, as well as in the north, which is Andersen Air Force Base. In addition to that, included the development of a ballistic missile defense system, also referred to as the THAAD. As well, Andersen Air Force Base was then to have the increased capacity of your B-1 and B-2 bombers, and the rotations of these exercises of these bombers included as far as Hawaii, Alaska, and the U.S. continent, as well as other fighter jets. Now, this is very significant when we look at our engagement with North Korea, because, of course, this is the primary reason why Guam is being targeted in these nuclear threats from North Korea, is because this is where these bombers are stationed. In addition to that, on the Navy base to the south, there currently was 3 in 2006, and so that's been increased with at least 3 more in our waters. So this military buildup that I speak of, the price tag changes all the time, but it's roughly $18 billion that's projected. It includes the dredging of live coral reefs, about 72 acres, which currently is on hold, although their development is kind of moving all simultaneously at the same time. Of course, the development of the THAAD, which connects us very closely with bases in South Korea, and of course is the technology he talked about earlier that is relied on in order to intercept any nuclear weapons that might be heading in this direction. In addition to that was the acquisition of additional holdings, which would increase the Department of Defense's land holding on the island to about 45%. I put it highlighted here in orange is the desecration of Letexan village. This is one of the most critical issues on our island at the moment, where we're continuing to resist the development of this land. They've recently gotten approval to clear a little over 1,000 additional acres for the purposes of live firing range trainings, which really makes our entire region the U.S. Department of Defense's largest training ground collectively. And it doesn't include just Guam, but extends into our waters, into our skies, as well as into our northern islands in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. Part of this increased buildup as well means the continued tapping of our already exhausted water system, and ultimately the difficult decolonization and our right to self-determination. In 2010, the Department of Defense acquired additional lands and seas and ocean space, as well as sky space to increase its training ground. And in 2014, an additional nearly 1 million square nautical miles were taken, which in size is larger than the states of Washington, Oregon, California, Idaho, and others on this slide. I have faces on the bottom, so I can't read the rest of the states. And most recently, earlier this year, just actually about a month ago, they've announced the intention of increasing that training ground even more larger into the ocean space that we have in our region. So we can totally understand and relate to the North Korea experience of these threats of shield. It's 10 days of drills at the sea, air, land, and cyberspace. Happens every 2 years. It's began since 2006. It includes all different branches of the military's Department of Defense. Roughly 18,000 people participate in this. And so these kinds of exercises, clearly, it's understandable that they would be seen as a threat. What then has the U.S.'s military legacy left to us in the Marianas? And the Marianas is the island chain in which Guam is situated. Massive land dispossession. Okay, the current land holdings is roughly 33%. If they get those additional acres that they're earmarking, that will increase to about 45%. So nearly half of our island will be occupied by U.S. Department of Defense. Those of us in Micronesia have a very long history with radiation exposure. Just a few days ago, we lost one of our champions in the region, Senator Tony DeBrum, Foreign Minister Tony DeBrum from the Marshall Islands. The detonation of the bombs in the Marshall Islands for the nuclear testing program didn't just impact the Marshall Islands in Micronesia. There was downwinds that impacted those of us on Guam and everybody in between as well. And so we have a very long history of understanding the horrific effects of nuclear presence in our environment, which of course not just makes toxic impacts your health outcomes. And so I can go on here about the military's legacy to our region, which really has been a horrific case example given our hyper-militarized state. But I want to end with the most operative question that we're getting from the media constantly. Guam's still in the media spotlight at the moment. We've never, by the way, had this kind of media attention that I've ever experienced in my lifetime. But people are asking, how are people on Guam responding? You know, you need to understand that Guam during World War II was an active war zone because of invasion from the government of Japan. And so really, in many ways, up this historical trauma. But as those of us in the peace movement know, especially those in the denuclear work, understand that playing with these nuclear weapons really is just something that humanity just does not have the capacity to be able to handle in terms of its outcomes. And we know that from the Marshallese experience. We know that from the experience in Hiroshima as well as in Nagasaki. And even with the most recent nuclear spill in Fukushima, the technology does not exist to be able to respond in a competent way of these experiences. So while our governments feel safe to issue out advisories of how to keep yourself safe in a nuclear attack, I mean, it really is this illusion of safety. And, you know, as part of our network, our international network of women against militarism, we really promote the concept of genuine security and moving into being able to create safety and redefining what safety looks like. Thank you.
Oh, Lisa, that was so powerful. Thank you so much for educating us all and joining us so early in the morning. We're going to end with Terry Kukulani. She is a longtime Hawaiian leader and peace activist. She's the co-founder of Women's Voices, Women Speak, which is the Hawaiian women organization working for peace and demilitarization. She's been a longtime member of which is part of the International Women's Network Against Militarism. Auntie Terry has led demilitarization education tours around the islands of Hawaii on the impact that the US faces wreaks on the people and the environment. So without further ado, I'm handing it over to Auntie Terry. Thank you.
It's thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this webinar. I'm not going to be getting into a very deep analysis. I'm just going to be mentioning a few issues here that we're facing in Hawaii that are current. Can you go to the first slide? The first slide, you see a gentleman holding up a manual. And I'm bringing this up because of this whole recent media blitz on the US and North Korea tensions. In Hawaii, there was a lot of press, last month in particular, on what happens with this very tense exchange between North Korea and the US, and where does Hawaii play in. So in this article, there is now talk about, in the event of an attack, a nuclear attack by North Korea, what happens to us in Hawaii? And so this brings up being prepared for a nuclear attack in Hawaii. And for me, and this was kind of heavy, because as a baby boomer, as a young person going into school, we used to actually normal drill that we did on a monthly basis. And I just wanted to comment, suddenly now this is becoming part of our culture again. And this is very frightening. So the next slide you see is threats of war and militarization. It is, I think, critical. And I think it's a very telling that women across the Pacific, actually internationally in the world, are not talking about just the threats, but talking about something more enhanced, and that how do we produce peace and diplomacy. And I think that's very important for us to have this kind of thinking and leadership. And I would recommend that women, that the audience actually go to the website, Women's Voices, Women Speak, our blog spot, and look at the statement that was produced on the situation of stopping war militarization in the Pacific. We just recently had 8 women from Hawaii in a diplomatic exchange, cultural, political exchange, go to Okinawa. And it reminded everyone again about the devastation of war, the impacts of war, both on a people and the memory of the horror of war, and also the physical devastation of military buildup, the kinds of environmental impacts that it has on the island environments that we have. And so anyway, I would suggest that people go to that. Next one. One of the current issues now on the island of Kauai is the THAAD missile defense. This becomes highlighted with the the recent discussion on the North Korea and U.S. Threats of a nuclear war. So Kauai, as a place that has testing sites for weapon systems, it's called the THAAD Missile Defense Area. It's on the west side of the island of Kauai. And so there's a lot of more discussion, thank goodness, on where Kauai is in terms of this issue. I can tell you that I've been hearing from people living on Kauai that there's been increased military aircraft activity that has been actually frightening for a lot of people. And so the signs of war, war preparation are there on the island. Next. And the thing about the aircraft, military aircraft, and its presence in the islands, not only in Kauai, but also on Makapu, that's the Canadian Marine Corps Air Station here on Oahu, is a very important issue for many of us. There were 48 Ospreys that were being transferred from Okinawa to Hawaii. There was an announcement of that last year. And Ospreys are very dangerous. They're called the Widowmaker, by the way. And we actually had one of the Ospreys that are now stored and housed on the island of Makapu. One of them actually crashed in Bellows Airfield close to Makapu in Waimanalo. And this is frightening. There's a very dense Hawaiian population along the coastline of Waimanalo, so close in proximity to some of this aircraft activity. So that's one big issue is the danger of this kind of activity that takes place and is sort of like normalized, among the community. It's like that's what's going to happen. I think more people are becoming aware of its dangers and beginning to voice their opposition to being subjected to this kind of environment. The other issue for us on the Big Island is the continued bombing activity on the island of the Big Island in the area called Pohakaloa. You have PPA Pohakaloa training facilities by the Army. Actually, all of the divisions of the military practice at Pohakaloa. And there's a lot of increased air activity and bombing going on in a land that was once used for depleted uranium tipped bullets. So there's depleted uranium in the soil. So when you have this kind of bombing activity, the soil and the winds come and the aerolizes, and that kind of the wind takes this contaminated soil into the community, and so it impacts people beyond the boundaries or the borders of the military's training area. And I think all of us are very concerned again about not only the bombing activity itself, but also the contamination that is associated with it. And then lastly, this is a very big one. We are also going to be experiencing RIMPAC in 2018. That's close. It's coming pretty soon. And this is when 25 nations, 45 warships will be coming to Hawaii. It's a very big event for the military, not only because it has these practices going on, the live fire training practices, military exchange and all this, but also it's a very big presence culturally too, like in Waikiki. It becomes like a military, July 4th on the island of Oahu. And so we are, gearing up to address the impacts of the RIMPAC exercises here on the island of Oahu, and generally in Hawaii and in the Pacific as well. I think that
Thank you so much, Terry. Well, that was quite some ground covered and some incredible information that was shared. We have about 10 minutes for some questions, and we've gotten a few. So let's see. The first one is directed to Hyun. How about the possibility that North Korea attacks South Korea? North Korea is not a threat to the world, but it does present a threat.
Solely aimed at the United States and nobody else. So North Korea, and we should also know that the current conflict, which is just the latest in a long-standing, ongoing war, is between North Korea and the United States. It's not what the corporate media tells us, that, you know, North Korea and South Korea are at war and the US is on the South side because we are their allies. No, the war is ongoing between North Korea and the United States.
yeah.
And it was the dying wish of the unification that respects both political and economic systems. And I think most people in South Korea know that you know, the current sort of so-called North Korean missile threat is really aimed at U.S. bases and the U.S. military, and not at South Korea.
Great, thank you, Han. I don't know if there's a bunch of other questions. I've gotten a few by email. One was from Joan Rousseau. Her question is the designation of war games off the Korean coast to be in violation of Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I am not aware of any efforts that are underway at the UN level to try to stop these war games. Maybe Hyun has some insight. The freeze is for freeze. North Korea has stated that it would halt.
In the chat room, you know, what is the most effective activity that we can be doing as peace activists in these uncertain times? I think that, you know, when situations are this bleak, they always create opportunities for us to pose fundamental questions, right? And I think that is to start talking, and I hear more people talking about how do we actually move away from a culture and an economy that is so reliant on the military-industrial complex, that is so shaped by it, and how do we convert the resources that go into, both monetarily, human resources that go into the military industrial complex, to a peace economy, to a peace culture. I think we need to be raising those questions, you know, in a serious level. And I think we need to be talking to labor movement folks, environmental justice folks, you know, about those questions, and building sort of solidarity across movements around those questions.
Thank you. And Lisa Natividad.
You know, 2 years ago when we crossed DMZ from the north into the south, that was one of the most profound experiences, honestly, I've had in my life as a peace activist. And you know, so of course, now that we're in this situation and, you know, Guam's gotten all this international media attention, that's always Korea, is that, you know, the North Korean people, in my mind, are very heartbroken people. If there's anything I took away from that experience in the North for those few days was that, as has been reported in our, that really want peace, and they're so heartbroken because they don't have that. So this whole global solidarity movement we have, I think, is so critical at this time. And I think we need to stay centered as well on the humanistic part of our connection with each other, because that's the piece where we tend to intellectualize, we tend to analyze, and that's all very important. But at the end of the day, we're just a community. I think we need to try to remember as we guide our work and as we engage this issue, we help educate others in our communities and in our lives, that we kind of the humanity part of this story. Thank you.
That's so beautiful. Thank you, Lisa. And Auntie Terry, some closing words.
I want to bring up, I didn't bring this up in my presentation, so I'll do it really quickly. I want to echo the call for education. I think it's really important. And Ellen Ray and I put together a tour for labor, people in labor, on the military and its presence in Waikiki, for example. And the military's presence in Waikiki is like it's there, it's hidden in plain sight. Waikiki has a huge army hotel. It's called Halikoa, and they also have a museum. They have a huge chunk of land where they have a park and a tennis court for their members, military members. So it's really, we do a thing called geopolitical tours in Hawaii, where we actually take people, like students and community people, out into the community and physically take them to places where the military is present, whether it be at Makapu, at Pearl Harbor, Keawelau, Pu'uloa, or in Waikiki, so that people can see things that have been normalized to their eyes. They don't really see it unless you point it out to them, that there's military presence everywhere. The military's presence is a military tourist kind of economy. I know Guam is going through the same thing. There is a military construction economy with military bases. Besides live fire training, you have housing development. And I think Korea is also facing that, the new development of military bases, that along comes huge military housing needs, right? And so construction is also supports this kind of complex. And so just to end, in Hawaii, we are very aware of, and have been for a long time, about the military occupation here in Hawaii. And I think we have to be vigilant about talking to each other, not only in our regions, but to each other like today. And thank you to the women's group internationally, where we can kind of, tune in and see what's happening in our particular regions, and also to encourage each other to ho'omau. Ho'omau means to continue to do what we're doing. And I think the continuation is leading to developing economies of peace. How do we do that? That's a challenge, and we need to have some of our younger people on board to think about a place without war, and to think about economies where we're talking about feeding people, in an environment that's healthy, and to talk about diplomacy and how do we live in this world together. Mahalo.
Mahalo. Thank you so much, Auntie Terry, and all of you for joining us for this amazing webinar. I just want to let you know that we recorded it. It would be great for you guys to share with other people, because when do you see these beautiful faces of women from on the ground giving this kind of fresh analysis? You don't. And so we have to create our own knowledge, and we have to share it with our community. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you for the speakers. This is just the beginning. The solar eclipse meant we are bringing down the old system and lifting up a new one built on peace, built on justice, and a new United States. So stay tuned for the next webinar, and please share this widely. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, Jacqueline.
Thank you.
Thank you.